This is part 3 of the true story of Erwin Bartmann, a soldier of the infamous SS Leibstandarte. In this chapter, we return to Ukraine, where Bartmann faced the full horror of the Eastern Front, from witnessing unthinkable brutality to being wounded in action and eventually thrown into the inferno of Prokhorovka, one of the largest and most chaotic tank battles in history. This is a chapter soaked in blood, fear, and the raw terror of war. With our shirt sleeves neatly rolled to the elbows, we strolled past an isolated farmhouse, stepping into a rolling green meadow alive with the song of larks. Just months before, during the darkest grip of winter, these same handsome birds had fluttered low along the icy roads, pecking desperately at crumbs revealed by the crunching wheels of our vehicles. The warmth of summer now wrapped us in a deceptive sense of calm, and Boris, always light-hearted, whistled a tune he'd picked up while stationed in France. Du hast Glück bei den Frauen, bel ami. Then, without warning, the sharp snapping zip of enemy bullets tore the piece apart. A few of our men grunted and dropped where they stood, unlucky victims of the ambush. I threw myself into the grass, heart pounding, as the Oberscharführer in charge, our red-faced Austrian comrade who had once proudly shown us the marvels of Paris, risked everything to lift his binoculars and spot the Russian gunners. Our sharpshooters returned fire with precision, attempting to silence the machine guns pinning us down. Crawling through the tall grass as if wading through a nightmare, I pushed forward to the last place I'd seen Boris. My breath caught in my throat when I found him. He was lying on his back, legs mangled, his trousers soaked red with blood. His fingers trembled, clawing uselessly at the air. Both thigh bones were shattered. I shouted, my voice cracked, frantic. Moments later, though it felt like hours, 2 medics arrived and carefully loaded him onto a stretcher. The Russian machine gun fire faltered. Maybe our marksman had hit something vital. We quickly formed a defensive perimeter as the medics pulled back, Boris bouncing gently on the canvas between them. Soon after, Russian infantry emerged from a low ridge nearby, supported by mortars and renewed machine gun bursts that forced us to retreat. Without anti-tank weapons or armor, we were sitting ducks. The Oberscharführer, visibly torn, made the agonizing decision. We had to abandon the wounded in the farmhouse. Some of us begged to stay behind to buy time, but he wouldn't have it. The Russians had numbers and firepower. Staying would be suicide. We left them behind. I remember pausing for just a second, laying my hand on Boris's arm, whispering goodbye. At dawn the next day, we counterattacked with mortars and machine guns and retook the field we'd lost, but the news that followed drained the blood from our faces. The wounded, those we had left behind, had been murdered. As Boris had been part of our Kompanistrupp, I was among those sent to the farmhouse to identify the dead. Inside, a sickening warmth hung in the air, heavy with the stale stench of blood. Flies buzzed in jerking, erratic patterns, waiting for the silence to settle before they feasted. One of the mortar crew was already there, standing silently amid the carnage. I joined him. We stared in mute horror at the bodies, some mutilated beyond comprehension. "The bastards," he said through clenched teeth. "Fucking bastards." His rage boiled over and he kicked a metal table, sending a blood-caked basin crashing to the floor. He pointed to a naked corpse slumped on its side. "Look at this one. Their bollocks, gone. They cut everything off." The amount of blood confirmed what we feared. "They were still alive when they did this," I said, my voice low. "The Russians made them watch as their Kameraden were tortured. Then it was their turn." In one corner, a heap of bodies lay crumpled together, their skulls split clean down the middle, faces frozen in silent screams. "At least they didn't suffer too long," my companion muttered. "They were in a hurry with that batch," I added grimly, and then I found Boris. My stomach dropped. His mouth was pried wide open in a grotesque smile, forced by the pliers from his own toolkit, their handles jutting from between his lips. The metal jaws had pierced his throat, visible now through the taut skin of his neck. He must have choked to death, slowly and in unbearable agony. That sight has never left me. Even now, years later, I shiver. War has many horrors, but few are worse than what I saw in that farmhouse. These planes, we laughed when we first saw them, those strange little biplanes that buzzed in from the east, like toys forgotten in the sky. The Polikarpov Po-2s, we soon learned. Nothing more than crop dusters, really. Fragile skeletons of cloth stretched tight over timber frames and held together with wire like some child's kite. The engines clattered with an uneven rattle, as if assembled from whatever scrap the Russians had salvaged from a village junk heap. The moment I first heard them, I was reminded of my mother's old sewing machine, the rhythmic foot pedal, the steady clack of the needle punching through fabric. That memory, warm and domestic, took on a darker shape. We nicknamed the planes Nähmaschinen, sewing machines. But they were no joke for long. These flimsy things proved more dangerous than they looked. They flew so slow, drifting on the breeze like leaves, that our Messerschmitts, too fast, too sleek, struggled to intercept them. One pass and they were gone. At night it was worse. The rattle would cease and silence would descend like a shroud. Then, like ghosts, they would swoop from the blackness, wires shrieking in the wind, before dropping fragmentation bombs with no warning whistle. Only shrapnel, screams and sudden fire. It wasn't just the wounds they inflicted, but the sleep they stole, night after night, wearing us down with each visit. Their pilots were women, tough and ruthless. We called them Nachthexen, night witches. In early June, under a cruel sun, a message came through the field telephone warning that one of our pioneer corps had just defused a poison gas shell. We were ordered to don our gas masks, stored in their usual aluminum cylinders. Since the shell had landed close to my position, I crept over to inspect it. Split wide open, it oozed a foul brown sludge. No one got hurt, thankfully, but our officers still radioed a complaint to the Russians. To our surprise, the reply came back quickly, an apology. Apparently, the gas shell had been used in error. Etiquette on the Eastern Front was bizarre at times. We answered their apology with a blistering salvo from our Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. Their 6 rockets rose in quick succession, trailing arcs of smoke into the sky like devil's spears. They fell on a hill ahead of the lines, detonating in thunderous bursts. Later, when we advanced through the scorched ground, we saw what remained of the enemy. Men of Stalin's elite guard, clad in fine blue tunics and boots with shining brass buckles, sat slumped where they had stood beside their artillery. There was no blood, no shouts, no twisted limbs. They had been killed by the pressure wave alone, struck down where they stood. It was as if death had crept up and tapped each one on the shoulder. Shortly afterward, I was transferred to lead 2 machine gun crews. It was a promotion of sorts, and I felt proud to have Ehlers and Koenig with me again. We had barely settled into our new role when dawn broke one morning and found us positioned on the lip of a high plateau. Below, a road junction came into view, flanked by 2 stationary T-34s. Suddenly, 3 black dots appeared low on the horizon. They dipped behind the tree line. "The bitches will be on us soon," someone muttered. I knew what was coming. Another run by the Nähmaschinen. We scrambled for cover. Their engines whined as they climbed to height, then eased into a sickly purr. From their bellies dropped a thick liquid, shimmering as it fell. It burst into smoke, then into brilliant white fire. Phosphorus. The cries of the wounded pierced the air. One poor soul near me caught a cluster of the burning pellets. The fire wouldn't die. He screamed and rolled, skin sizzling. There was nothing we could do. Even small phosphorus wounds often meant a slow and miserable death. Then came the call. Our Oberscharführer needed volunteers to destroy the tanks. I stepped forward immediately, joined by a Rottenführer and an Unterscharführer from my Kompanistrupp. We mounted a Zündap motorcycle with sidecar and raced downhill, wind whipping our faces. I listened as the 2 men, older and more experienced, discussed tactics. I said nothing. I was still only a Sturmmann, the lowest rank among them. "We'll stop out of sight and approach on foot," said the Rottenführer. The Unterscharführer gave me a crooked grin. "I'll stay with the bike in case we need to make a quick getaway. You 2, earn yourselves a tank stripe." We abandoned the motorcycle beneath a thicket of trees and crept close, 50 meters perhaps, from the idling beasts. No sound of voices, just the distant hum of insects and the occasional creak of metal under the sun. The T-34s sat with both hatches open, their turret lids raised like ears. That's why we called them Mickey Mouse tanks. We circled carefully, keeping low to the grass and shadows, until we were behind them. Only a narrow stretch of open road remained between us and the tanks. The Rottenführer unslung his machine pistol and pushed his grenades deeper into his belt. "Don't drop them," he warned. Then his eyes locked with mine. I nodded. We were ready. "The one on the far side's yours. See you back at the bike." He sprang from cover like a panther. I followed, legs pumping, heart slamming in my chest. I grabbed a handhold on the sloped rear armor and heaved myself up. The metal burned against my fingers. I unscrewed the grenade's end cap, pulled the lanyard and opened the turret hatch. A crewman inside blinked at me in confusion. He didn't even have time to reach for his weapon. The grenade dropped into his lap. I slammed the hatch shut. Behind me, the Rottenführer's tank burst into flame. I leapt down and ran. A second later, the tank I had hit erupted from within, the blast lifting me off my feet. But I was alive, and we had done it. At company headquarters, we reported our mission and waited. I was giddy with pride, certain I had earned the coveted Panzervernichtungsabzeichen, the tank destruction stripe awarded to men who destroyed a tank alone. But an officer, stone-faced, explained the regulation. Only one stripe per tank, no matter how many men had been involved. 2 tanks, 3 men. Only 2 awards could be given. The Rottenführer and Unterscharführer, both higher in rank, received them. I was told, vaguely, that my role had been noted. No stripe, no official recognition. Just a pat on the back, and a promise that might never be fulfilled. Still, I knew what I had done. I had climbed onto that tank alone. I had looked the enemy in the eye. That was enough. We were making good progress through a narrow forest cut when the sudden roar of a Russian fighter screamed over the treetops. Its shadow flickered like a ghost across the forest floor before vanishing as quickly as it came. The engine faded to a distant drone, and for a moment I thought the pilot had passed us by. But then the sound shifted, rising in pitch, like a predator circling back for the kill. I ordered the 2 machine gun teams under my command to ready themselves. The routine was well practiced. Schütze 2, as always, positioned himself to support the barrel of the machine gun on his shoulder, acting as a human stand, bracing for the moment the aircraft came into range. But something went wrong. As the fighter bore down and its guns flashed, panic seized Schütze 2. He flinched, ducked his head, and in that split second, his shoulder slipped behind the weapon. A burst of bullets erupted, and the unimaginable happened. Half his head was gone. He dropped face first into the mud, blood spurting from the ragged wound. Yet somehow, he was still alive. The man who had fired the weapon dropped the gun, his mouth open in a twisted, soundless wail before calling out in angst instantly, barking orders to a motorcycle crew just arriving. They hauled the dying man into the sidecar, his mangled skull cradled awkwardly, and sped away in a storm of exhaust. The machine gunner stood frozen, pale as death, unable to speak, only able to watch the retreating bike with his comrade. That kind of accident, that kind of mistake, hung heavy in the air. He had just killed his own friend. From that moment on, the practice was changed. The assistant would no longer face the enemy aircraft but the gunner instead, blind to the danger and hopefully immune to fear's reflex. I believe it was on the 3rd or 4th of July when we took up position in a stretch of muddy ditches left thick and slippery by days of rain. The guns of the enemy were silent for now, but the stars above shone with cold indifference. We crouched in silence, nerves coiled tight. My breath came slow. It was not the cold that made me shiver. It was what we all felt deep down in our bones. An officer soon arrived to speak to us. "Our target is Teterovino," he said. "Remember the name on your sleeve. We fight for the Führer, for Germany. Good luck." Then, far off, the engines of our panzers rumbled into life. The night vibrated with steel and oil. The hours passed with maddening slowness. My gut churned with hunger and a strange, jittery fear. I was still thinking about the accident, still haunted by it. Finally, as dawn crept over the eastern rim of the world, the signal came to advance. By late afternoon, we reached a defensive position near a small village. After hours of fighting, we threw ourselves into the roadside ditch and slumped into a half-sleep, oblivious to the artillery that thundered in the distance. The next day we pressed on, following in the wake of a Panzerkeil, our tanks forming a wedge that punched into the enemy line. The Russian defences came one after another: trenches, minefields, anti-tank guns. We fought our way forward, yard by yard. A camarade to my right suddenly twisted toward me, his face a mask of confusion and horror. A shell, one of our own perhaps, fired too low, had bored a hole the size of a man's arm straight through his chest. He took a few unsteady steps, then fell. From the ridge ahead, a Soviet tank squadron appeared like phantoms, but our Tigers were waiting. One T-34 took a direct hit. Its turret launched into the sky atop a geyser of fire and smoke. A ring of soot hung in the air above the wreck, a sign of Kachins fought like devils but fell short. As we climbed the ridge, black smoke rolled around us. A trail of shell casings led to the gutted husk of one of our own Tigers. The turret was cratered, beaten, bruised by impacts that hadn't penetrated, until one finally did. A molten hole had been punched near the turret's base, metal cooled into globules like candle wax. No massive explosion. They must have run out of ammunition, held their ground and died in silence. By the time we reached the wooded outskirts of Prokhorovka on July 11th, we were only a skeleton of the force we had been. The sky wept, the wind howled through the trees. At midday, 4th Company received the order: clear the forest of Russian defenders. The shelling began at once. The trees exploded around us. We dived for any shelter we could find. A line of abandoned slit trenches, dug by Russians days earlier, saved us. 7 of us remained from the 12 who had entered the forest. No one spoke. There was only the thunder of detonations, the scream of shell fragments, the pounding of your heart in your ears. A tree nearby took a direct hit, disappeared in a bloom of splinters. Then a shell burst above us. Something struck my shoulder hard. The world spun, everything dulled. "Irwin's hit!" It was Ella's. I felt him pressing a bandage to the base of my neck. "You need to stand," he said, trying to lift me. I hooked my fingers into his belt, staggering after him through the woods, blind in one eye, vision faded in the other. Every shadow was a blur. We stopped. Ella's tensed. "Verdammt, the forest is full of them," he hissed. I could barely answer. We lay still, hidden. I felt no pain, only cold. I remembered my training. Pain is in the brain. I focused on that thought like a lifeline. Eventually we made it to a first aid post. Ella's had saved my life. The cries of the wounded filled the clearing. I lay on the grass, unable to move, eyes locked on the shafts of sunlight breaking through the leaves. "This one's gone," said a voice. A boot nudged my leg. I flinched. "This one's still alive." A medic knelt over me, examining the wound. Strange. No exit. No pleural puncture. The shrapnel's still inside. We'll send you to the field hospital when there's room. As I waited, strange memories swirled, walking beside the lake in Schlochau as a child, my mother telling me tales about the golden dome from the witch's tower, hidden beneath the water. Then my father's furious voice: "How could you resign from the church, Irwin?" Full of unconsciousness that felt too much like death. My chest swelled like it would burst. I counted seconds, I counted heartbeats. When at last they carried me to the operating tent, Dr. Jacob examined me. Shrapnel embedded high in the shoulder, still inside. He looked tired. "No time. I'll clean it and stitch it. No anesthetic." An ether mask was pressed to my face. I inhaled. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. "I'll have to proceed," the doctor said. He sliced the skin while I clenched my teeth. Pieces of torn flesh dropped into a tray beside me. He sewed the wound tight. Just minutes, but it felt eternal. Then it was done. I was allowed 1 hour of rest before being taken to the station. We waited on the platform day and night until finally a freight train appeared. No beds, no nurses, just cattle wagons. We were hauled inside. The doors slammed shut. We were leaving Prokhorovka. Lulled by the gentle rocking of the wagon and the metronomic rhythm of steel wheels ticking over the tracks, I slipped into a slumber so deep it smothered the burning in my chest. Sleep, at last, brought its mercy. How long I remained on that train, I could not say. Time had dissolved. When I awoke to the murmur of voices, I found myself in a modest ward inside a hospital in Kharkov, surrounded by a handful of fellow wounded from the Waffen SS. In neighbouring rooms, Wehrmacht soldiers occupied their own beds, their moans and snores a chorus of shared affliction. Days passed, and my strength gradually returned. I could sit up unaided. I even began to walk, and as my lungs began to unclench from the invisible vice around them, I found myself speaking more often with my fellow patients. One morning an officer entered the ward, thin, respectable, with gold-rimmed glasses perched on a sharp nose. He moved from bed to bed, speaking with deliberate softness, asking about families, wives, children. His manner was disarming. He patted shoulders, where shoulders remained, and held hands, even if only one was left. There was no stiff officer's coldness in him. When he reached my bedside, I told him of the chaos in the woods near Prokhorovka, how the shrapnel had found my back and buried itself somewhere deep inside me. He nodded, murmured a few quiet condolences, and was about to turn away when he paused and said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" I hesitated a moment, then admitted, "A smoke would be good." It had been far too long since I'd felt that familiar draw of tobacco and the calm it brought. He smiled, reached into his tunic, and drew out a cigar. "Would this do?" he asked, sliding it from its elegant wrapper. He handed it to me, then fished through his trouser pocket for a small pair of scissors. With precise fingers, he clipped the end of the cigar. "They say Prokhorovka was hell," he added, as he reached once more into his tunic and pulled out a matchbox, blue and yellow, rattling in his palm. But as he offered me a light, the ward matron spotted us. She jabbed a finger toward a sign on the wall, "Rauchen verboten." The look on her face was enough to freeze a charging bull. I offered the officer a sheepish grin and slipped out into the corridor, leaning against the cool plaster wall. I turned the cigar between my fingers, admiring the rich dark brown of its tightly wound skin. Raising it slowly to my nose, I inhaled the earthy sweetness of the tobacco, then struck a match and touched it to the tip. The first pull washed through me like morphine. I closed my eyes, thought of nothing, just silence. A soft, miserable moan dragged me back to reality. It grew louder, insistent. I tried to ignore it, then sighed, annoyed, and followed the sound. A side room, a Wehrmacht lieutenant, propped against pillows, his face a lifeless grey. His eyes cracked open when I stepped inside. "Do you need the doctor?" I asked. "I'm dying," he rasped. "I'm dying." His words, cracked and dry, echoed with finality. "What happened?" I asked, stepping closer. "Bullet, through the lung," he croaked. I saw the way his chest barely moved, how his lips trembled. Trying to offer comfort, I muttered the line we had drilled into our heads at Lichterfelde. "Pain is in the brain," but it rang hollow. I took a pull from my cigar and offered him a drag. He turned his head away. "No thanks." "Better get going," I said, already walking backward toward the door. "The matron'll be after me for smoking in the corridor." He groaned again. "I'll check in later." When I returned that evening, he was gone. They'd already taken the sheets. A few days later, the pain returned with vengeance, sharp, fiery, and constant. Every breath felt like a blade scraping my lungs. A doctor examined me, grimaced, and vanished. When he returned, he wheeled in a mechanical contraption that looked more like farm equipment than a medical tool, a long needle affixed to a clunky machine with a handle. "This might be a little uncomfortable," he said, positioning himself behind me. Before I could protest, the needle jabbed through the skin and slipped between my ribs, burrowing deep. I clenched my jaw as white-hot agony bloomed in my chest. With each twist of the crank handle, the device popped rhythmically, trying to suck out what the doctor assumed was fluid from my lungs. After minutes of futile effort, the doctor grunted. "It's no good. We'll try another way." He ordered a nurse to fetch a syringe. When she returned, I stared in disbelief. The needle was enormous, a brutal-looking spear that would not have looked out of place in a carpenter's toolbox. The moment it entered my chest, I arched my back with a guttural cry. It hunted blindly inside me, twisting, poking. The doctor mumbled. "No fluid. Nothing after all." Then it hit me. A sudden, breathless panic. I couldn't inhale. My lungs refused to obey. I gasped, mouth wide, chest burning. Unwilling or unable to treat me further, the doctor transferred me to a Wehrmacht surgical unit in Kharkov. There, they stripped me of my uniform, left me in only my long johns and undershirt, and marched me to a crowded ward where beds were stacked 3 high. I climbed to the top bunk, grateful I still had the strength. My stay in Kharkov was brief. Before long, I was placed aboard a proper hospital train. Unlike the others, this one had real beds, real nurses, Danish, I think, and rows of medical equipment neatly strapped to the walls. The train rolled through Silesia, stopping in Katowice, where we were met by women from the local Nazi party. Each wounded man received a gift, beer, wine, or chocolate. They smiled, handed out parcels, said kind words. It was almost surreal, from fire and blood and shattered limbs to wrapped gifts and painted smiles. Finally, we arrived in Judenau, a village near Vienna. Strauss waltzes greeted us from a small orchestra on the platform. The townspeople had turned out to clap for us. We, those who could still walk, marched in a line down the sunny streets. I wore only my long johns and undershirt, cheeks burning with embarrassment, but there was no time to change. Behind us, the more seriously wounded rode in wooden carts, pulled by horses too old or lame to serve in the army. I remember thinking it looked almost medieval. The hospital was clean, bright and peaceful. But for days afterward, I was haunted by dreams, wandering the streets of Berlin in my underwear while strangers pointed and laughed. A ridiculous fear, perhaps, yet somehow not so different from the shame that sometimes clings to survival. They stood in the porch of what had once been a monastery, 2 nurses clad in thick rubber overalls, their faces unreadable, their voices brisk and professional. "Let's get you out of these filthy clothes," one of them said, peeling back the layers caked in grime, sweat, and dried blood. With the last vestige of dignity gone, I stood there naked as they washed me down with warm, soapy water. I ought to have felt humiliated, but the sensation of cleanliness after so many days in rain-soaked trenches was a luxury beyond words. Just as I started to enjoy the comforting warmth of the sponge against my skin, they wrapped me in a clean dressing gown and led me to a bed with snow-white sheets that billowed like the clouds of heaven. Only those who've been deprived of comfort for long stretches can truly understand what a privilege a clean bed really is. In Judenau, my initial stop, the staff did their best despite the overcrowded conditions. Meals were served in shifts, but after having nearly starved several times on the Eastern Front, I had no complaints. A few days later, I discovered that there was an SS hospital not far away in Vienna. I approached the duty doctor and suggested that it might be more appropriate for me to be transferred there. "But there is a problem," I admitted with a grimace. "I seem to have lost my uniform. Might you inquire about a replacement?" He promised to make some calls, though his expression didn't inspire much hope. A few days later, he returned with a weary look and a bundle under his arm. "This is your travel pass," he said, handing over a folded sheet. "And this is your new uniform." He placed the heap of cloth at the foot of my bed, and I stared at it in disbelief. It was a tattered, patched-together mess. Grey fabric, clearly salvaged from a First World War uniform, had been stitched over the knees and elbows like a joke. The tunic sleeves ended 5 centimetres too short at my forearms. The trousers hung 10 centimetres too long over my ankles. "I'll look like a bloody scarecrow in this," I muttered. The doctor didn't hide his smirk. "Sorry, it's the best they could find in your size. I'll get arrested by a gendarmerie patrol and hauled off to a Strafbataillon before I ever make it to Vienna," I half joked. The military police were always eager to prove themselves behind the lines. He sighed and retrieved a pad of forms from his coat pocket. "I get it," he said with a tired shake of his head. "Here, I'll write a note explaining the circumstances." To this day, I suspect that someone in the Wehrmacht quartermaster's office had deliberately chosen the most absurd-looking uniform for a man from the Waffen-SS. While many Wehrmacht soldiers respected the Leibstandarte at the front, there were always those in the rear who resented us. The hotel where I stayed before travelling on was a lovely old building, its veranda lined with white wrought-iron railings and offering a splendid view of the mountains. Once again, I was the only Waffen-SS man in sight. I spent my days wandering through the nearby Viennese countryside. A forest path led me to the ruins of Burg Merkenstein, a crumbling fortress left behind by the Turkish invasions. Nearby were the quaint villages of Gainfarm and Grossau, with their picturesque churches and delicate little buildings. Sometimes I lay in the Schloss Park under the shade of a wide plane tree, watching birds dart through the leaves. In such a place, so peaceful and green, it was almost impossible to believe that the world was still on fire beyond the horizon. Then one morning, after breakfast, the hospital's Oberstabsarzt handed me my release papers, a travel pass, and a sealed letter marked with the stamp of the Leibstandarte headquarters at Lichterfelde. As I opened it, an irrepressible grin spread across my face. I had been granted 3 weeks of home leave. I had been promoted, not 1 but 2 ranks, from Sturman to Unterscharführer. I had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the Wound Badge in Black for being twice wounded. Finally, recognition for the mission in Kharkov and the destruction of 2 tanks. But there was one catch. I had a uniform, but no insignia to show my new rank. If a Wehrmacht patrol stopped me and saw my papers didn't match my markings, I could easily be mistaken for a deserter. By sheer luck, I found a small military supply shop in town. On presentation of my documents, they sold me the silver collar braid and pip I needed. With my train leaving Bad Vöslau later that day, I rushed back to the hotel and hastily sewed the insignia onto the collar mirrors of my scarecrow uniform. When I arrived at the SS hospital in Vienna, the guard burst into laughter. "Wait here," he said between wheezes. "Don't move." Then, pointing at me, "Where were you wounded?" "Prokhorovka," I replied. He returned with 2 others in tow. "Look at him!" he shouted. "It's the scarecrow of Prokhorovka." Soon, every man in the building well enough to stand had gathered to have a laugh at the walking patchwork who'd stumbled in from the Eastern Front. I must admit, I laughed too. I was assigned to a ward filled mostly with other wounded men from the Leibstandarte. Most of them peppered me with questions about who was still alive, who'd fallen, and what the current situation was like at the front. I answered as best I could, though in most cases I simply didn't know. Still, these conversations helped me integrate quickly with my new kameraden. The following day, I was taken to a room where a doctor performed an X-ray on my chest. He returned with the developed film and held it up to the window. "There," he said, pointing, "a fragment of shrapnel lodged between your ribs. We'll get it out tomorrow morning." I awoke from the operation alone. Nobody had come for me, so I ventured out of the room on my own. That caused quite the stir. Nurses ran after me, berating me gently as they escorted me back to bed. Later that day, the surgeon appeared, holding a small bronze-coloured shard between his thumb and forefinger. "You've been lucky," he said. "It entered near your shoulder blade, passed through your lung, and missed your heart by millimetres." Not long after, they presented me with a fresh, new Waffen-SS uniform. It fit perfectly, except it lacked the cuff title, Adolf Hitler. Still, after everything, it felt good to look like myself again. To break the monotony of recovery, a group of us were driven into the city to visit the Prater Park. We picnicked in the shade near the river, wandered through the oldest church in Vienna, the Ruprechtskirche, and ambled through cobbled alleyways that suddenly opened onto a wide boulevard. There stood the magnificent St. Stephen's Cathedral, its golden, green and white tiled roof shining like polished jewels, and its towering spires pointing straight to heaven. But it wasn't the grandeur I remember most. It was the little detail carved into the stone stairway. The Fenstergucker, a mason immortalized at his window, chisel in hand, gazing forever at those who come to marvel at his work. I had seen the devastated cities of the East, the bleakness of Russia and Ukraine, but Vienna was something else entirely. For a boy from Berlin, it felt like another world. When the doctors finally deemed my recovery complete, I was sent to Bad Vöslau, a charming spa town once frequented by the rich for its thermal baths and massage houses. The Wehrmacht had taken over a grand hotel as a convalescent home. My room was on the first floor, just a few steps from the steaming pools. I had come a long way from the bloodied fields of Prokhorovka, and yet, in many ways, it still felt like I was wearing that scarecrow's uniform. The station at Schlesischer Bahnhof had barely changed, yet the moment I stepped onto the platform, I felt the air grow colder. Not from the weather, but from the eyes of the policemen who loitered near the exit, scanning each face for guilt, for desertion, for the telltale twitch of fear that might betray a spy or a soldier gone rogue. I kept my stride steady, eyes forward, gaze unwavering. "May I commend you on your smart appearance?" The voice, falsely courteous, held the chill of suspicion. I knew immediately it was meant for me. "Danke," I replied over my shoulder without breaking stride. "Halt." My insides tensed. I turned slowly and retrieved my Soldbuch and leave pass, handing them over with as much nonchalance as I could muster. He studied them, long enough to toy with me, then locked eyes with mine. Finally, with a brief nod, he waved me on. It must have been the crispness of my new uniform that drew his attention. I left the station behind and made my way through Berlin's streets, taking the most direct path to my parents' flat. Grosse Frankfurter Straße buzzed with life. Trams groaned along the lines, and the curbs, still marked with white for blackout navigation, shimmered faintly in the sun. As I turned onto Strausberger Straße, that strange, warm feeling of home crept up on me, the kind that rises in the throat, thick with nostalgia. I stood for a moment, taking in the sight of our block. My mother, bucket at her feet, mop in hand, had just finished scrubbing the entranceway. Her back was to me, and the steam from the hot water rose around her like smoke from a battlefield. A tram bell clanged nearby, and once it passed, I crossed the street quickly. "Mama, I'm home." She turned slowly, stunned metal that had nearly taken my life. "Look," I said, holding it out between thumb and finger, "hardly anything." At the door, father appeared, face tight with emotion. "Ah, Erwin," he said, voice catching slightly. "I saw you from the window. Come, you must tell us everything." I handed him the fragment. He turned it in his palm, weighing not the metal, but the meaning. It felt good to be home. That night, in the hazy place between dreams and wakefulness, I found myself once more in that ambulance, the smell of blood and sweat clinging to the canvas, surrounded by broken bodies, limbs severed, faces twisted. "Going to sleep your whole leave away?" I rose, drenched in sweat, peeling my vest from my skin. My legs still ached from the nightmarish cold endured in that truck outside Rostov. "Morgen, Mama," I muttered. Half the first day of my leave was already gone. It was too hot to spend at the bakery ovens, so I decided instead to visit Friedrichshain. There, for the first time, I saw the Flakturm, massive, grotesque, like a mist stirred inside me. I wandered further down the old path beside Friedenstrasse to the Märchenbrunnen, where fairy tale fountains danced and the carved figures of grim stories sat frozen in time. My father used to bring me here as a child, but now even this place felt like part of some distant legend. The innocence was gone. I drifted next to the Sturmlokal in Lichtenberger Straße, seeking a quiet beer. The Luftwaffe Unteroffizier tending the bar spoke of the Flakturm, and soon I found myself being led down into the cellars where stacks of emergency supplies were piled like preparations for siege. "Blankets, Dixie cans," he said, gesturing. "A lesson from Hamburg." We're next. I thought of the buildings I'd seen burn, only now they would be German. That night he invited me to stay for the music. Gypsy trio, fiddle, clarinet, accordion. They'll take your mind off it. Later, I made my way to Memmelerstrasse to visit the Glaser bakery and learned that Fritz, my old journeyman, had gone off to fight for Volk und Vaterland. When my 3 weeks were up, I returned to Lichterfelde barracks and reported to an Obersturmführer seated behind a desk polished like glass. He questioned me about the Eastern Front, then delivered the news. My battalion was in northern Italy, disarming the Italians who had deserted us. But for now, there was no assignment for me. "You'll stay here at Lichterfelde," he said, "but be ready to return at a moment's notice." I requested permission to stay with my parents in Friedrichshain, and to my surprise it was granted on 2 conditions. I had to report in person twice a week and remain on call. Before long, even that was relaxed. Once a week by phone was enough. Each visit earned me a week's worth of food rations, much to my parents' relief. On the evening of November 22nd, my brother's wife gave birth to a baby girl, Angelica. I was now an uncle, but that joy lasted only hours. The air raid sirens soon began their mournful cry. The British returned with fury. My parents went to the basement, but I climbed to the attic and watched the firestorm from the skylight. They struck west of Alexanderplatz. Coloured flares, Christmas lights, drifted down on parachutes, marking the death zones. Bombs fell in waves. Fires lit the city from below, painting the sky blood red. The next day I rode the Straßenbahn to the centre and walked through the wreckage. Smoke still rose from the ruins beyond the Tiergarten. Rubble lay thick. Civilians, bent-backed and silent, cleared debris or pushed carts filled with salvaged belongings. The first bitter glances I received as an SS man stung deeply. On Oranienburger Strasse, the Neue Synagogue lay in ruin. A Feldwebel told me 2,000 had died, most of them women and children. The zoo was obliterated. Even the elephants, he said, gone. I returned home to a cold silence. My father sat reading the Völkische Beobachter, and beside him, the letter from the church announcing my resignation. Without a word, he crumpled it and hurled it at me. "How could you do this to me?" he said. There was no point in defending myself. I left and walked back to the Sturmlokal. There, over beers with the Luftwaffe Unteroffizier, we spoke of lost opportunities. Dunkirk, the non-invasion of Britain, the brutal tactics in Ukraine. The Luftwaffe man nodded. Maybe if we treated them better, more Ukrainians would have joined us. I agreed but said no more. Even here, words like those could be fatal. The gypsy trio struck up their music again. Outside, Berlin still burned, but inside, the notes swirled in the warm air, and for a moment, I let myself forget the war. The drunken laughter of men looking for a warm body and a fleeting night's comfort grew louder as the evening wore on. Across the bar sat a slim, light brown-haired woman with that quiet, seasoned allure some Berlin women seem to carry, neither shy nor brazen, just present, watching, almost daring. My Luftwaffe companion noticed her too, cocking his head to one side with a grin. "Not a bad looker," he said with the casual admiration of a man used to charming women. "What do you think? 30. "About your age," I said without much thought. He tossed back the last of his beer and ran a hand through his thick curls. "Things to do," he muttered, slipping on his cap. "I'll leave you to her. See you later." His words struck me oddly, a little disjointed from the alcohol perhaps, and I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. But as I sat there, mulling over the taste of stale beer and smoke, I noticed the woman now sitting with a pair of older men across the room catch my eye. She didn't look away. "See something you like, soldier?" she called, her voice dry, almost amused, as she stubbed her cigarette with a final twist into a metal ashtray. Before I could summon any clever reply, she was already making her way over, slipping effortlessly into the seat my Luftwaffe friend had vacated. She was striking up close, though I now saw the fine cracks of fatigue at the edges of her face. I offered her a cigarette. She accepted it with a graceful motion, holding it between lips coated in bold red lipstick while she dug through her handbag for a light. "Here, let me," I said, sparking my lighter and holding the flame steady as she leaned in. Her elbow brushed the table, her forearm resting casually, and our knees touched. She didn't move away. The band had resumed their playing, a whirling combination of fiddle, tambourine, and clarinet. It was wild music, the kind that belonged to dim rooms and restless people, a kind of free, frenzied rhythm that offered a brief escape from the war, from the orders and the ruins and the dying. Music for the ears, my Luftwaffe friend had called it, and for once I knew exactly what he meant. We talked the way strangers do when both know exactly what the night is leading toward. Names, jobs, vague glimpses of life before the bombs. She worked as a typist, she said, and while she spoke, her hand slid beneath the table. At first I thought she was adjusting her stockings, but her fingers brushed against the inside of my knee and began tapping, gently drumming. "I hate the bombing," she said suddenly, her voice lowering. "I get so frightened at night. Alone." As if sensing the hesitation forming in my mind, she added quickly, "Don't worry, I'm not a whore, I want to feel something real, before we all burn." Her hand crept higher. I was almost 20. My only sexual experience was that brief, awkward visit to the Paris bordello, and that felt like a lifetime ago. She wasn't the girl of my dreams, but she had a warmth, a softness, and a woman's scent that stirred something primal. We both wanted the same thing, though perhaps for different reasons, she for comfort, I for hunger. And when you're starving, you take whatever is offered. When I returned to the Sturmlocal a few nights later, the Luftwaffe man gave me a grin that said he knew everything. "Good in bed, isn't she?" he said with a laugh, slapping my back. I simply nodded, not quite sure what to say. I had learned something in Berlin, that a soldier of the Leibstandarte, especially one walking the streets in uniform while so many other men were gone, would have no trouble finding female company. Sometimes they were young, sometimes older, but all seemed to carry that same restless, knowing look. I started keeping a diary just to keep the names and faces from blurring together. Berlin, it seemed, had become a city of shattered windows and open doors, where women, lonely and uncertain, reached for any passing figure in grey to feel something again. All I had to do was glance, offer a half smile, and the rest would often follow. The war had made lovers of strangers. There was an elegant villa nestled within the grounds of the Lichterfelder barracks, with a short flight of wide steps once flanked by flower beds in the summer. It served as the officers' mess and regularly hosted grand parties, which I had become familiar with during my training back in 1941. I had often served there as a waiter, offering the guests trays of schnapps and fine cognac while they danced and laughed into the early hours of the morning. In those heady early days of the war, every ambitious soul seemed eager to curry favour with the Leibstandarte, Hitler's personal guard, from which the future leaders of the Reich were said to be drawn. Celebrities, actresses, even politicians came through those doors, especially around Christmas and New Year when festivities reached a fever pitch. We NCOs were allowed a sliver of that privilege. On rare occasions we could invite girls to our quarters, so long as they were properly signed in and out at the guard post. Normally the girls had to leave by midnight, but on New Year's Eve that curfew was extended to 1 in the morning. Still, any man caught breaking that rule faced a drop in rank and pay. Serious consequences, especially for a newly promoted Unterscharführer like myself. Around my 20th birthday, just before Christmas 1943, the frostbitten skin on my legs began to act up again. Even the lightest brush against my trousers caused the wounds to break open, seeping a foul mix of yellow fluid and blood. I quietly thanked the doctors who had barred me from returning to the Ostfront. Out there, this would have been unbearable. After a few days of putting up with it, I went to the Waffen-SS hospital on Unter den Eichen, a stately boulevard of oak trees not far from the barracks. Only one other man sat in the waiting room, another Unterscharführer from the Leibstandarte. As I walked in, he rose and offered his hand. "Szymanski," he said, eyes gleaming with mischief and strength. "Bartman," I replied, gripping his oversized paw. The man was a giant, built like a cupboard. "Haven't seen you around," I added, a silly comment given that someone like him would stand out in any crowd. "Just posted to Berlin," he said, in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. We swapped medical miseries while we waited. He had taken a twisted stomach wound in Italy, and now had the unfortunate habit of releasing gas that could empty a room. "Bullets spun right through my gut like it got caught in a ship propeller," he grinned. He was called in first. Moments later, he reappeared, waving a paper with a cheeky smile. "Permission to fart anywhere, anytime," he announced proudly as he disappeared down the corridor. When it was my turn, the doctor poked and prodded before recommending I check in with the sickbay back at the barracks for regular dressing changes. What I didn't yet realize was that this would become a lifelong routine. The real trouble came with Szymanski later that New Year's Eve. We had somehow managed to smuggle a very drunk girl out of the building after the celebrations without attracting attention. The first morning of 1944 greeted us with icy air and stillness. "There's a spot near the officers' mess," Szymanski muttered. "Quiet, out of sight. We'll lift her over the fence there." We half-dragged, half-carried the girl behind some bushes to a stretch of iron railings. From a window above, a girl's voice squealed in drunken laughter. I imagined a chase through silk sheets and cognac fumes. "I wish I was an officer," Szymanski sighed. "Stop dreaming and help me get her over," I hissed. We heaved her up to the top, but she was too limp, and we couldn't risk impaling her on the spikes. We gently lowered her down again. "Wait here," said Szymanski, disappearing into the shadows. He returned moments later, grinning. "We're in luck. The sentry on duty owes me a favor. We'll slip her out the gate. No signing." And that's just what we did. Led her stumbling through the guardhouse while the sentry turned a blind eye. I buttoned her fur coat and helped her to a seat at the tram stop as Szymanski laughed with the guard. Weeks passed. Then one day, on a crowded tram headed toward the city centre, I noticed a familiar woman climbing aboard. Our eyes met. I smiled. Her brow furrowed, then recognition sparked. Her mouth dropped. She began shoving past the passengers until she reached me, shouting, "You thoughtless swine!" and swung a slap that narrowly missed. "I could have frozen to death," she screamed. I didn't wait for more. I leapt from the moving tram, barely landing on my feet on the snowy pavement. That night in the medical mess, while the others celebrated, I chose a quiet bed and drifted into sleep. It must have been well past 3 in the morning when someone shook my shoulder. "Shh, it's me, Szymanski." "What time is it?" I groaned. "Get dressed," he whispered. "We've got a problem." My uniform was already laid out. I stumbled after him up the stairs. "The medics buggered off while I was taking a piss," he muttered. We walked into the mess hall, and there she was again, lying completely naked on a fur coat, wearing only a pair of bright red shoes, bathed in candlelight at the centre of the room like some painting come to life. "Who is she?" I asked. "An extra from the film studios in Babelsberg," he replied nervously. "She should have gone home hours ago." "And her clothes?" "Gone. Maybe she wasn't wearing anything under the coat." "How are we getting her out?" I asked, already furious. "I'll think of something," he said. The woman suddenly threw back her head and started to sing, slurring her words. Szymanski clamped a massive hand over her mouth. "For God's sake, Szymanski!" I hissed. "Don't smother her!"